Alrighty, again, thanks for joining the Powered by dsgrid webinar. Just a couple of housekeeping notes before I turn things over to Elaine Hale. This webinar is being recorded. It will be posted publicly afterward. And just so everybody knows, attendees' microphones and videos are going to be muted for the duration, but you can still submit your questions to the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom panel. It's in the center of the screen. And we would love to hear your feedback on it. We will send out a feedback form after the webinar is complete. And with that, I would like to hand things over to our GPAC analyst for dsgrid, Elaine Hale. Elaine, take it away.
Great, thank you, Tim. As Tim said, my name is Elaine Hale, and I'm with the Grid Planning and Analysis Center at NREL. And today I'd like to talk to you about a capability we call dsgrid. This is a joint effort with some of my team members listed on the screen. And I just want to go through first a motivation, a problem statement as to why we've developed this capability called the Demand Side Grid Toolkit. I want to give a quick overview of the tool, and then I want to do a deep dive into the three key things that dsgrid is. dsgrid is a load modeling approach. It is published data sets, and it's open source software. Finally, I'll wrap up by telling you how to access all of these capabilities, and then we'll wrap up with a Q&A session. So first, the problem statement. As you maybe could have guessed from the name of the research center I'm in, the Grid Planning and Analysis Center, we're really focused on grid planning and what the future grid will look like. But it's always been the case that load forecasts are a key input for power system planning. And so if we're thinking about future grids, we also need to think about future electricity loads. And NREL is a really good place to do that because we've been thinking about both sides of the grid for a long time. So first, if we take energy efficiency, we have different groups at the lab that are looking at the different demand side sectors. And here I just want to highlight the building sector. The buildings groups here at NREL, since for several decades now, have been working to better understand energy use in buildings. And for a long time, that really focused on energy efficiency. And I'm highlighting just a couple efforts here that were in the 2000s and 2010s, where we got to the point where we could really describe how to make both residential and commercial buildings a lot more efficient than business as usual. Similarly, around the same time frame, our grid modelers were understanding what it would be like to integrate a lot more variable renewable energy into the grid. And we were starting to see graphs like the one on the bottom right, where we are looking at the different kinds of electricity generation over the course of the week, and really realizing that the shapes of the wind and solar generation combined with the shape of the load is really driving a lot of the dynamics in our future grids where we have more variable renewable energy. And so we really laid the groundwork 10 or 20 years ago, just understanding that energy efficiency really impacts our load magnitude, and variable renewable energy integration really makes the shape of load a lot more salient to our power system planning activities. Since then, we still work on those core aspects, but we've also started to really look to understand electrification. So here I'm highlighting that we have a lot of work on transportation electrification, and we're also looking at building electrification and noticing things like there's a big difference between inefficiently electrifying end uses or electrifying with more efficient equipment, more efficient envelopes. It can really impact the peak demands you end up seeing as you're applying electrification throughout the building stock. On the variable renewable energy integration side, pretty early on, we recognized that flexibility is really important in systems with a lot of wind and solar, and that flexibility can come from technologies like batteries, but it can also come from demand side flexibility or demand response. And so we've gotten to a place where we really understand that there's a lot of changes on both the demand and the supply side of the grid that make it really important to understand how electricity load magnitude and shape are changing, and also how electricity load could possibly be flexible to help integrate more variable renewable energy. I also have some small text at the bottom of this slide just to point out once, I won't come back to it in this talk, but we're certainly starting to look more into trying to understand indirect electrification for both industrial and energy storage end uses. And that further complicates this picture by integrating multiple energy systems together. For instance, if we use a lot of hydrogen generated from electricity, that's obviously a new coupling that would also need to be accounted for, but I'll leave that for another day. So in summary, our work at NREL has really anticipated a lot of the long-term load forecasting challenges that are really being appreciated by a lot of power system planners around the world today. And I just wanted to highlight here that in addition to just the characteristics of load I was talking about, there's some other aspects that are important to understanding future electricity load and how that interacts with our power systems. So first, we want to have time synchronized load, wind, and solar data to make sure that we're capturing the correlations between those different profiles correctly, and therefore planning for future systems in a reliable way. This work is also highly cross-sectoral and cross-disciplinary, which can always be challenging. We need to understand the demand side sectors like buildings, transportation, and industry. We also need to understand the power sector, and we need to take a deep dive into both the physical resource and the economics of load flexibility. And we're doing all of this under deep uncertainty. There's a lot of things changing in a lot of ways, and it's impossible to know exactly what things will look like in 10 or 20 years, but we need to do some sort of planning here so that we can get a sense for what the possibilities are and get ourselves on the right path. So with that, that's kind of why we're doing all of this and some of the background that led to this work. So I just want to give a quick description of dsgrid, and then we'll go into each of these aspects in more detail. But the main idea of dsgrid is to leverage bottom-up modeling of demand-side sectors to produce data for power system planning. And we're doing this and helping others do this in three basic ways. First, we here at NREL as a research team have developed a load modeling approach that lets us do this and has let us create future projections and what-if scenarios for electricity load shapes. And it has also let us do research into interactions, especially between demand-side flexibility and what's happening on the bulk power system side. Second, a lot of these data sets that we create to perform research, we also publish, and we've been doing that through something called the Open Energy Data Initiative, or OEDI. And finally, and more recently, we've developed open source software that you can access through GitHub that is basically support for us as we do this kind of work. We've designed it to be flexible and extensible. So while a lot of our work might be national scale for the US, the software is completely generic and able to be used for other kinds of end uses. And some of the key things that it does is it helps us align data across different geographic, temporal, and sectoral scales. It handles our time series manipulations. It allows us to do data query, and it provides some QA/QC functionality. So first, let's dive into a little more detail on dsgrid as a load modeling approach. So the first project that we did was really is shown here on the left, and was really a proof of concept to prove to ourselves that we could take bottom-up simulated data from the different demand-side sectors and align it all together and get something reasonable. And yeah, like I said, this was really a proof of concept kind of project. So the data we produced have some obvious flaws, but we were also able to feel confident that this was a fruitful way to continue pursuing this work. And for example, for that project, that was the first project that developed the Comstock capability for modeling the commercial building stock across the US. And so it wasn't really a calibrated model yet, but we kind of demonstrated that we could line up all these data. And then since that time, both Comstock and ResStock have gone through a large calibration process such that we expect that the load shapes would really line up a lot better now than they did this first time that we tried doing this. Then the other project that we've completed using this load modeling approach is the Los Angeles 100% Renewable Energy Study, or LA 100. And I want to go through that in a little more detail just to give you a feel for what this kind of modeling workflow can provide. So for this project, my team was asked what electricity demands will LADWP, that is the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, need to meet starting now and continuing through 2045. And to answer that question, we had 3 different load modeling teams, which we got data from each of these teams and then integrated it all together to perform, to create the dsgrid load projections. And each team modeled 3 different scenarios: moderate, high, and stress. Our moderate load projection had both moderate amounts of increased efficiency and electrification. High had a lot of energy efficiency and a lot of electrification. And then the stress case had all the electrification of the high projection, but a lot less energy efficiency, and also a different build out of electric vehicle chargers to change the timing of charging demand, so that we could see kind of what a worst case for the grid might look like. So just show you a few illustrative results. This is the peak electricity demand for each model year and for each load projection. And what we saw through our from 2025 to 2040 was that, or one of the things we saw was that the main difference between the high and the stress projections was really the amount of energy efficiency in the building sector. However, by 2045, there are enough electric vehicles on the road that we also saw something interesting on the electric vehicle side, which was that by 2045, the electric vehicle charging infrastructure and assumptions about when people plug in also impacted the timing of peak demand. So whereas for all the scenarios in all years up to 2040, the time of peak demand was at 4 p.m., by 2045, we had 3 different times of peak demand. The moderate case still had 4 p.m., but the high case, the peak moved all the way up to 2 p.m. because there was a lot of workplace charging. And for the stress case, there was a lot of residential charging, which pushed the peak back to 7 p.m. We were also able to look at breakdowns kind of per customer or per unit of commercial building area. And we could see different trends in the projections by sector. So in the residential sector, we really saw a big impact from electrification all the way through the modeling horizon. Whereas in the commercial sector, efficiency was also really important. And so we saw an overall reduction in commercial building load from 2020 to 2045 based on those efficiency measures. These kinds of data also let us create estimates of demand response capability. So this was our estimate of demand response capability at the time of system peak. And we can see that these load reductions are mostly available from large commercial and industrial customers, building cooling loads, and then in later years, for the high electrification projections, we could also see contributions from electric vehicle charging. And then because we're looking at very high shares of wind and solar, we're also very interested in the ability of demands to shift the time of their use. And so we also estimated shifting capability, which a lot of that was projected to come from electric vehicles in the late 2030s and into 2045. These data were also rolled up into overall results for the study. And I thought it was really interesting that the high projection shows a lot more benefit than the moderate projection, in that the volumetric costs for electricity are actually lower with high energy efficiency and high electrification, while also providing more greenhouse gas reductions when we're considering all the demand side and supply side sectors that were modeled. All right, so that was an example of the demand side grid modeling approach. Now I want to talk briefly about the data sets that we've published and will be publishing in the future. So first, that proof of concept study that I mentioned, we have published those data and they're available on OEDI. And the links are in these slides, which will be available after the presentation. And similarly, there's a data viewer for the Los Angeles 100% renewable energy study, and you can browse our results there and you can download select slices of the data. And then what I'm really excited to share with you today is that we just released some light duty electric vehicle charging profile data that were produced by our colleagues that are part of what's called the Tempo team, some transportation modelers here at NREL. And what I want to point out here is the projections that are available are kind of summarized in this graphic, but then there's the underlying data are at the county level and also have different charging profiles for every month of the year. And so we're able to see both differences in county by county, which are based on different demographics, different kinds of vehicles that are owned in those counties, different levels of vehicle miles traveled in those counties. And we can also see the impacts of weather. So for example, here we have New York County, New York, which has very little car use compared to the rest of the country. So this dashed line is the average for the country. And these are per capita normalized profiles. And so, yeah, New York has very little electric vehicle charging because people are using other modes of transportation. Whereas in these Colorado counties, there's more energy consumption than average, and you can really see the warm months having the least amount of energy use and the cold months having the most amount of energy use, which is just based on the well-known tendency of electric vehicles to use more energy when outside temperatures are either really cold or really hot. All right, and this brings us to the third aspect of dsgrid. dsgrid is open source software. So basically, after we completed that proof of concept project, which was done for the Electrification Future Study, or EFS, and we did LA 100, we knew a lot more about what it takes to take high resolution data from demand side sector modeling teams and compile that into something usable by grid models. And so we started over on the software side and designed the software stack that we really need to do this work more cleanly and efficiently. And we designed this, not for a specific project, but to be a generic tool for this kind of work. And so it's not tied to any specific geographic scope or temporal scope or anything like that. It's very configurable just with the data you input into it. And then once you've designed a data set, there's a generic query interface that lets you analyze those data. And then I just want to point out some of the key features. which are first that it's aligning the dimensionality of different data sets, which I'll go into a little bit more in a couple slides. And we handle all the time series data transformation inside the dsgrid software, because if you've done any work in this kind of area, you know that anytime you have to try to get timestamps to make sense and line up across multiple data sets, it can be very painful and very tedious. And so we've been incrementally pulling all of those operations into our software so that hopefully we can just do it once, and a lot of people can avoid that pain by leaning on this code that also includes tests to make sure these things are working as expected. And then I want to point out that why this is hard. So when we're trying to align these data sets to each other, we usually end up exploding the data on one or more dimensions. And I just wanted to give an example of the data kind of shown above in this graph in a simplified way is pretty big, just sitting on disk as individual data sets, about 59 gigabytes. But then if you pull those all those data sets into memory, it becomes 164 gigabytes. And then if you actually align across all of the dimensions, you get into terabyte scale data. And in this case, we had these 28 subsectors, 61 end uses, about 3,000 counties, and hourly timestamps. And so, we knew that this was the kind of thing that happens when we do this work based on our previous projects. And so we chose the right kind of software stack to help us with that. And currently the big data technology we use on the back end to do this work is Apache Spark. So I just want to give you a quick flavor for what it's like to work in the software. We basically have a few key concepts that are used in the software to make sense of all of this and do the work. Basically, dsgrid is organized around the concept of a project. And a project is a set of data sets and a set of dimensions. So the individual data sets are registered with dsgrid by data set contributors, and then they're submitted to projects with the help of what are called data set to project mappings. Basically, this project has a set of base dimensions that is a specific description of what the geographic resolution, the time resolution, the sectoral resolution, all of these different dimension types that are listed in the bottom left corner. All of those are defined at a base level for the project. And then if you want to use a data set in the project, you need to provide a mapping from however the data set is defined along those dimensions to the project's base dimensions. On the other side, we want to be able to produce results for a lot of different types of data users. And that's facilitated by what we call subset or subset dimensions and supplemental dimensions that let you produce outputs at yet another set of resolutions that could be different from both how the data sets are defined and what the project-based dimensions are. So for example, I just want to walk through these 3 rows, just describing how data sets can have a different resolution than the project, which can have a different resolution than the data outputs. So in this top row, I'm referring to a project called DCARB, which is an ongoing project from which we expect to publish new data sets over the coming year to years. So that's one reason to stay in touch with us, is to see when those data sets are getting published. But in any case, that project has data sets at different levels of geographic resolution. For example, one data set is at the EMM region level, the electricity market module level. That's a NEMS thing. Other data sets are at the county level or the state level or the census tract level. And all of those data sets map into the project-based geography, which is at county level. And then we use that county level data to map into other geographies such as the Regional Energy Deployment System, or REED's balancing authority level, which lets us go on to do capacity expansion modeling. The second row is the LA100 example that I walked through before. In that case, the data sets came in as sample buildings or sample electric vehicles, or at basically the parcel level, which we called the agent level. And then we had to map those data into that parcel level. That was our base geography. And then we produced outputs that were at both the secondary transformer level and at the substation level. And then at the bottom, just, we've had some conversations, especially with people wanting to do distribution level modeling. And that brings up maybe some other geographies that might be of interest. For instance, you might have data sets at the census tract, the feeder, or the feeder level, or you might have AMI data at the meter level. So you might have data sets there, and maybe the base geographies might be at the substation or the bus level, or the feeder or transformer. So finally, in this section, I just want to highlight kind of where we have done work in the past and are doing work now, or considering what we're considering for the future. So we've, these first 3 rows kind of really highlight our national scale work, and also the work we did for LA100. We're continuing to do a lot of national scale work with that decarb project that I just mentioned. And so we'll be publishing data sets at that level. And then we've been, there's some folks starting to work with dsgrid at the distribution system level and exploring maybe using it to assist with capacity expansion modeling for distribution systems. And we're starting to explore the possibility of using dsgrid in an international context, with more at the country level, with a little bit lower resolution data than what we've been doing at the US national scale. Right, to wrap up, I just want to provide pointers to all the things I've talked about today. We've got the reports listed here, the data sets, and you can follow our code development at GitHub. And you can also see there how we're defining data sets for the decarb project is also available on GitHub. But what I really want to encourage you to do is to sign up for our newsletter. We have our website's shown here, and if you scroll to the bottom of that website, there is a newsletter which we only use for real announcements about either new publications or new data sets. And that's also where we would make any major software announcements, should there be any. And so that's a great way to find out about new data sets when they're fresh off the presses. Finally, if you have any specific inquiries, please do email us. Our email address is dsgrid.info@nrel.gov. And with that, I'd like to wrap up and go to Q&A.
All right, thank you very much, Elaine. We have one question so far, and this person's asking, how is dsgrid different from other energy modeling tools like TIMES and LEAP, etc.?
So my understanding of TIMES and LEAP is that they're doing more of the supply side of analysis of how they're how energy is going to be supplied to demands. I know they have some demand modeling included as well, but dsgrid's really just about compiling data so it's usable across multiple settings. So it's not doing any modeling on its own, but it's making data created by a lot of different teams accessible to each other for additional uses.
All right. We have another question coming in. What is the relationship between dgen and how easy is it to sync between the two?
So dgen, sorry, in the decarb project, we have actually ingested a dgen data set. And so it's to the extent that we've ingested the dgen scenario you want in dsgrid, then you could access it through dsgrid. But it's kind of the question about syncing is would be kind of answered generically. So any if you wanted to make if you wanted to use if you wanted to make a dgen data set accessible through dsgrid in order to pipe it to a different energy modeling tool or anything like that, you would just need to make sure that the scenario you wanted had been registered and submitted with dsgrid. And that answer would basically be the same for other kinds of tools, like for ResDoc or Comstock, for example, our building energy stock tools.
All right. We have another question asking if dsgrid can be used for utility automatic demand response ADR analysis.
I think I would have. It can't be. Nobody's explored any use cases where dsgrid's used in a kind of automated real-time way. So I think I'd have to know more about what the questioner means by ADR. I'll just say that, if you have load data in dsgrid that describes the end use breakdown in detail, then that can help you do demand response analysis, but it would be kind of part of a workflow, not the whole workflow.
All right. Let's see. Do we have any insights on handling big growth in AI users?
Yes. So, and I guess, yeah, this is kind of where dsgrid isn't a model, like it's not endogenously figuring those things out, but you can certainly make a projection or a forecast of how you think data center load growth will look in the future and include that in a dsgrid project. And yeah, we've actually been talking about that as part of the decarb project to just make sure that we're capturing the amount of data center load growth that people are seeing in their systems kind of coming online in the next 1 to 5 years.
Okay. Can you also discuss the relationship between REV, and dsgrid? Is there
Yeah.
capacity modeling for distributed energy generation within it? dsgrid specifically?
I'll start with the first part. So REV is a tool at NREL for creating wind and solar generation profiles. And so what I'd say is that REV and dsgrid are complementary, that we're on the dsgrid side, we're trying to choose weather year assumptions that align with what assumptions are being made in the REV tool by our various grid modelers, so that at the end, if you take load data from dsgrid and you take wind and solar data from REV, that they'll be time synchronized and meshed together. It's basically suitable for doing your grid planning analysis, whether that's capacity expansion or production cost.
Right. Kind of back to the circling back to the AI question. With huge amounts of AI demand coming online, how often do we plan on updating the modeling?
Yeah, so the plan, not fully realized yet, but in the process of being realized, is to update US national data about once a year, kind of on the same at the same frequency as the NREL standard scenarios. So we have updated assumptions on the demand side every year, just like we do on the supply side.
And let's see, this next one. Can you speak to what the dsgrid interface looks like?
Yes. So I'm going to speak to, well, at least 2 interfaces. So first, I think it's probably easiest for people to use what we've done by accessing the data sets, and specifically the Tempo light duty electric vehicle data set we just published. We basically we published the full data set which is very large, as a partitioned Parquet file. And many of you probably aren't familiar with that, which is perfectly reasonable. Basically, a Parquet file is a binary data format that is used in the back end of a lot of modern data architectures. And it shows up, if you have a very large data set in a partitioned Parquet format, when you first navigate to it on your computer, it just looks like it kind of looks like a file, but it's really a folder. It has the .parquet extension, but it's really a folder, and you can open that up, and it's just kind of a nested data structure. And by being partitioned, it means you can access kind of a meaningful slice of the data at each directory level, and you can open those directories up by themselves to get kind of a slice of the data. But we also published more aggregated views that are going to be more accessible for folks. And those are basically also in Parquet format mostly. There's a couple of CSVs included. But we also wrote documentation for this whole data set that describes each of the views that are available and provides some examples for how to work with those data, whether they're Parquet files or CSV files. And we basically recommended 3 different tools for accessing the data. You can access the small data sets with pandas. There's which you can use through Python. And then there's a relatively new technology called DuckDB that has interfaces to a lot of different software languages, but we also provide examples for how to work with that in Python, even though you can work with it in other languages. And then only for superpower users, if you want to work with the really big data sets, then Apache Spark is what we use for that. So that's on the data side. Basically, we're providing different views and describing those views and providing examples for how to work with them. The dsgrid software itself has, you kind of work with it through configuration files that are in JSON 5. And it also has a command line interface for some functionalities. And that's kind of what's available currently. That could change over time.
All right, we have a multi-parter here.
Okay.
Okay, first up, how do you model demand response, specifically electric vehicle shifting in time?
Yeah. Let's start there.
Yep.
So we have done work in that area, and it's definitely related to what I talked about today, but it's also a little bit to the side of that. But we kind of started from that same tempo data set that I talked about, but to model the electric vehicle managed charging, in addition to just baseline charging profiles, we worked with our transportation team to simulate what we call envelopes, where we basically have an early as possible and a late as possible charging profile. And we take those data and turn them into a battery-like model for each sample vehicle. That gives us a very quantitative description of the flexibility of that individual vehicle. Flexibility here meaning what bounds within you could like schedule the charging and still fulfill all trips. And we have a published report that basically goes through all of that and also talks about the aggregation process, and then looked at the value of that managed charging in a production cost model. We're currently doing follow-on work to extend that approach to work with our capacity expansion model, which involves both making those models kind of workable in this in a larger scale capacity expansion model that's national instead of regional, and that's going out to 2050 instead of being a single year. And we're also developing supply curves for that managed charging so that the REIDS model can select how much managed charging it actually wants. We're also planning in the coming year to figure out how to put the data that describes flexibility like what I just kind of talked about, how to put those data into the dsgrid platform that I've been talking about today. So I think all that's just to say that there's a lot of past and ongoing work on the flexibility side, and we will be working over the coming year and years to merge that into this more public-facing dsgrid project and working to make those data available as well.
All right, so part two of this question kind of is specifically referencing slide 23.
Okay.
And it's, do we assume that folks who usually charge at 7 p.m. will charge in the middle of the night, and those who charge at 4 p.m. charge at 8 to 10 p.m.?
Let's see. Oh, sorry, which slide was that? 23?
23, yep.
Okay. And then say the question again.
Okay, so it's asking if it's related to times that people charge. So asking if
Yeah.
folks who usually charge at 7 p.m. will charge in the middle of the night. If those who charge at 4 p.m. usually charge 8 to 10 p.m.
So it's not that prescriptive here. So especially for LA 100, we created this shifting capability. Well, and actually, and in the more recent work as well, we often characterize the overall shifting capability, and there's definitely the bounds I was talking about before that, yeah, we're calculating how much you can shift individual vehicles. But oftentimes we do the analysis of where the load actually gets shifted to. We do that analysis more at the bulk power level. And then we sometimes take those results and then kind of assign the shifting to individual vehicles to check that it's working. But we don't do that on a routine basis. That's just sort of a side check that our assumptions are okay. So usually we're just leaving that shifting result at the bulk power level, at that megawatt scale level. And just because that's where the focus of our research is. But in practice, what aggregators need to do is get that instruction for how much load they need to shift, and then send those signals down to the individual vehicles to make that actually happen. So we're just usually not doing that level of analysis. But I do have colleagues here at NREL that are more frequently doing kind of distribution feeder level analysis. And I think that work more often would be looking at those individual vehicle shifts. So in summary, we're very well aware of needing to get those signals down to the individual vehicles. And we do sometimes do those calculations to make sure that we're not assuming too much flexibility at the bulk power scale, but our main results are usually at that bulk power scale. So we're not kind of getting to that level of fidelity of who's exactly shifting to when.
All right. So our next question, the data showed residential usage exceeding commercial and industrial usage. Is this a complete picture, or is there missing data on the commercial and industrial side?
So this is just an example for LA 100. And it's just the Los Angeles city footprint. So it's, it's just peculiar to that location. It would look very different in different places.
And does the dsgrid dataset include usage by data centers?
We don't have any published data on that yet. We are developing an initial projection now. And we're working on that with colleagues at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory who are updating I think it's a 2016 report on data center energy use. So there's definitely more on that coming, and we're very aware.
Next question is, can the dsgrid model, or can dsgrid model community battery storage?
So I would say that for community battery storage, you'd really want to be figuring out how to dispatch those batteries. And so that would be more of it would be a different kind of tool than dsgrid. So the one that's coming to mind for me is REOPT, which figures out what kinds of distributed energy resources you might want to deploy on a given location, and then would also simulate how those DERs would be used at that location.
All right, up next, what other tools interact with dsgrid? Are there model outputs that are dsgrid inputs or dsgrid outputs that can be directly for inputs to other tools? We had suggested that it connects to reads in the one
Yeah.
slide.
Yes. So kind of the workflow we're working on most right now is to we're connecting on the building side. There's profile data from Restock and Comstock are getting fed into a building load projection tool called Scout. And then dsgrid is ingesting those data for buildings. There's a whole transportation modeling team using Tempo and EVIX and Polaris that's out of Argonne. That transportation modeling team has submitted data to dsgrid. And then there's an industrial modeling effort as well that's being led out of Lawrence Berkeley, but has collaborators here at NREL and at Oak Ridge and at Argonne. So we have a data set from them, and we're working to connect those data sets with initially reads, but we're also going to be working this year to, like I said before, we're going to be working to understand what flexibility data we want to go through this workflow, and we'll be working on making sure that we can support production cost modeling in addition to capacity expansion modeling. Yeah.
Okay. Next, do you consider any prime for dispatchable energy with decarbonizing retrofits like CCS?
We are not doing anything with CCS currently. CCS has been analyzed in reads, and I think will continue to be analyzed in reads sometimes. And then there's also another tool being developed called Finito that is looking at kind of the fuel and feedstock and carbon capture aspects. So it has a kind of different focus, but has been designed to run with reads as well, so that you could look at demands for all different kinds of fuels and look at carbon capture.
All right, up next we have, how is load flexibility represented in dsgrid data?
So currently load flexibility data, if you wanted to represent load flexibility in dsgrid today, you would need to just provide an alternate load profile that's been kind of pre-dispatched. But what we'll be working on in the coming year is better cataloging the kinds of flexibility data we want, and then supporting the highest priority versions of that. I'll just expand a little bit that, you know, some load flexibility today is accessed by people responding to time of use prices, for example. And so if you wanted to model that, you could do that on the demand side, and the result would just be a different load shape, which you could put into dsgrid. But if you want something that's more directly managed by the grid, something like a direct load control program, or managed charging that's managed by like a third-party aggregator who's actively giving your vehicle signals, then you need to have a more endogenous, a representation of the flexibility that can be dispatched directly by the grid model. And those are the kinds of data we haven't supported in the dsgrid toolkit yet, but we'll be working to do so in the coming year or so.
All right, so just so you know, we're coming up on our time here, and we still have a few questions left, but we'll try and get them as quick as possible. The next one is that is there any work going on for grids doing more carbon dioxide removal?
Yes, or yeah, I think I'm not sure if this is what's intended, but that brings to mind for me the direct air capture kinds of technologies, or DAC, and that's definitely analyzed sometimes using models like READS or like or integrated assessment models like GCAM.
Okay, next we have, is NREL doing explicit analysis of the degree to which large industrial uses like data centers, AI, and hydrolyzers are and will be price sensitive and shiftable loads?
Yes.
Okay. Short and sweet, love that.
Yeah, sorry.
Um,
I think we definitely are. I don't think I have anything specific to point people to, but are yeah,
okay.
yeah, and there's some past work too that talks about that a little bit. So it's yeah, there's past work and ongoing work, and we're definitely aware of some end uses being very price sensitive and others not.
All right, up next, when you describe mapping the various inputs across the grid to an analysis unit, does dsgrid allow you to do visualization of those geographies anywhere along the way?
We um, we don't currently have a visualization capability kind of baked in, but I think that'll be coming. And you can also, I think the way we've been working mostly is doing doing analysis in Python or with a Jupyter notebook where you can do the visualizations that you want. So I think that would be kind of the answer today, is that we don't provide that directly, but would expect people to be using their favorite software package to do that. But I think there'll be more and more demand for that. So I wouldn't be surprised if we didn't do something there.
All right. This next one is about EVs, saying it EVs provide transport service and potentially grid services. How do we account for the unpredictability of EV owners, torn between transport and energy sales to the grid?
So I think, it's always important to keep in mind that your car is for getting you places first, and definitely for the grid second or third. But I think there's a lot of power in numbers and in aggregation. So if you have, if you have a third-party aggregator managing a lot of vehicles, then they will come to understand what their uncertainty bands are, and will be able to operate managed charging or other grid services uh, better and better over time as they get more comfortable forecasting what their fleet's doing. And definitely all that math gets easier at that aggregate fleet scale as compared to just a single vehicle.
Okay, we got time for about two more questions here. So let's go to this one first. How related to the answer on what the interface looks like and what a new user might start, is dsgrid accessible to an outsider? And if an energy analyst external to NREL wanted those kinds of results, would they need to work with a tool expert to leverage the capabilities of dsgrid?
Yeah, I think unfortunately the answer today is I think you would need to work with us to use the software directly. I think someone with a lot of institutional capability could use dsgrid on their own, but they'd probably want to talk with us to get a feel for it first. So I think the recommended way to work with dsgrid right now is to access data sets, but definitely if you think you're interested in using the software, do reach out. Like, it might be a good fit. Just don't want to make it sound easier than it is. Oh, and I guess I'll also say, there could be improvements in that over time, and I think that's another reason to sign up for the newsletter. Just, we can make announcements through that if as things become more accessible.
Great. Okay. Final question. Is there any plan from the dsgrid team to get down to sub-meter level analysis for categorical loads? And to ensure effective DR, having analysis would be, this person's asking or saying that it would be essential to divert the electrical consumption pattern. So can you kind of shed light on that one?
So I don't currently see us dealing with data. Like, I can imagine us dealing with some historical advanced metering infrastructure data. So that would be like at the meter level. And maybe we would even disaggregate that to end uses, but we're not currently aiming at use cases that would be more real time or operational, which is kind of what that question is sounding like to me. I know there's some different sort of more, there's some time series database kind of products that I think are trying to get more at that real time use case. And dsgrid's definitely more in the kind of planning and analysis space.
Right. Thank you very much. That's all the time we have for questions today. If you would advance the slides, please. So thank you very much to Elaine. Coming up next, join us next month, August 13th, for Powered by Cambium. Senior Energy Systems researcher Peter Gagnon is going to discuss his work leading the Cambium project and the data it produces for the U.S. energy sector. And again, that's August 13th, same time, 10 a.m. Mountain Time. Thank you very much, everybody.